The doors of the great hall slammed shut behind Elena before she had even finished stepping through them, and the sound echoed like a slap across the stone walls. Every eye in the room turned toward her. She had known this moment was coming since the guards pulled her from the forest path at dawn, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of so many stares pressing against her skin at once. Alpha King Damien sat on his high seat at the far end of the hall, one hand resting lazily on the armrest, the other tapping an impatient rhythm against his knee. He did not rise. He did not even lean forward. He simply watched her walk the long stretch of red carpet toward him, his eyes narrowing with something between curiosity and contempt. "So this is the trespasser," he said, before she had even reached the base of his throne. His voice carried easily across the silent hall, rich and commanding, the kind of voice built to be obeyed, the one who dared cross into Packland without permission. Elena stopped a respectful distance away and lowered her eyes, not out of fear, but out of the manners her mother had drilled into her since she was a small child. "Keep your head low in rooms that do not know you. Speak only when the silence has nothing left to say." "I was gathering herbs, Alpha," she said quietly. "A child in my village has a fever that will not break. I did not mean to cross any line." A ripple of laughter moved through the courtiers lining the walls, sharp and mocking, the kind of laughter that comes easily to people who have never once been afraid of losing everything. Elena kept her eyes down and let it wash over her. She had heard worse. She had survived worse. Damien finally rose from his throne, descending the 3 low steps with unhurried authority. He circled her slowly, the way a wolf circles something it has not yet decided whether to trust or to break. "Do you know what the punishment is for setting foot on our land without a name to vouch for you?" he asked. "I have a name," Elena said. "Elena." "A name is not the same as a lineage," Damien said, and something in his tone shifted, sharpened, turned cruel, in a way that made even some of his own courtiers go still. "You have no pack, no mother who claims you, no father who will answer for you. You are nothing but a motherless Omega, who wandered too far from whatever gutter raised her." The words landed in the silence, like stones dropped into still water. Elena felt the sting of them, not because they were true, but because they were said so publicly, so carelessly, in front of a hall full of strangers, who now looked at her with fresh disdain, as though his cruelty had given them permission to feel the same. Somewhere near the front of the crowd, a noblewoman in deep violet silk pressed a hand to her mouth to hide a smile. Others murmured behind their hands. A few simply stared, waiting to see how far their king would go, and whether the girl would break. Elena did not break. She lifted her chin, slowly, and for the first time since entering the hall, she let her eyes meet Damien's directly. There was no anger in her gaze, no pleading, only a strange, quiet stillness that seemed to catch him off guard, if only for a heartbeat. "You should be careful what you call a person you know nothing about," she said. A few gasps rippled through the hall. No one spoke to the Alpha King that way. No one, especially not an Omega with no pack behind her, no title, no protection. Damien's eyes flashed, something sharp and dangerous crossing his face. "Careful," he repeated, almost amused now, circling back to face her fully. "You come into my territory uninvited, and you dare to warn me." "I am not warning you," Elena said. "I am telling you the truth, and you are free to ignore it, as most people do." Behind Damien, an older man with silver hair and a long gray coat shifted uncomfortably. This was Gareth, the king's most trusted advisor, a man who had served 3 generations of the royal bloodline and had learned, over many long years, to recognize the particular kind of silence that came before something enormous. He studied Elena more closely now, noting the calm in her posture, the steadiness in her voice, the way she did not so much as flinch under the weight of the entire court's judgment. Something about her did not fit the picture Damien was painting. "Alpha," Gareth said carefully, stepping half a pace forward. "Perhaps we should hear the full account before." "I have heard enough," Damien interrupted, waving a hand without looking at his advisor. "She admits to trespassing. She admits to having no pack, no name of consequence, nothing to offer this court but excuses about a sick child no one asked her to save." He turned back to Elena, his expression cold now, performative, playing to the crowd that watched him with rapt attention. "In another life, you might have been treated with mercy. But I do not extend mercy to those who sneak onto my land. and then lecture me in my own hall. I did not sneak, Elena said evenly. I walked the path in daylight, in plain sight, carrying a basket anyone could see. If your guards mistook an herbalist for a threat, that is not a failure of my honesty, it is a failure of their attention. A few nobles actually laughed at that, quickly stifling it when Damien's glare swept over them. Elena felt a small, strange flicker of satisfaction, though she kept her face composed. She had not come here to win a war of words. She had come here because she had been given no choice, dragged from the herb fields by guards who would not listen to reason, and now she intended only to survive the hour with her dignity intact. Damien stepped closer, close enough now that Elena could feel the heat radiating from him, the barely restrained power that came with being an alpha king, the kind of presence that made most people in this hall lower their eyes without needing to be told twice. You have spirit, he said quietly, so only she and those nearest could hear. I will give you that, but spirit will not save a motherless Omega from the consequences of trespassing. Spirit will not conjure a pack that does not exist, to speak for you. You keep saying that word, Elena said. Motherless. Because it is true, is it not? Damien's voice rose again, carrying back out to the wider hall, reclaiming his audience. No one has come forward in your defense. No pack has sent word, no mother stands behind you to answer for your actions. You are alone in this world, girl, and alone people are cheap. Alone people can be punished without consequence, because there is no one left to seek justice on their behalf. The hall fell silent, waiting for Elena's response, waiting to see the girl finally crumble under the weight of a truth spoken so plainly, so publicly. Some of the courtiers leaned forward slightly, savoring the moment the way people savor the fall of anyone who dared to stand too tall for too long. But Elena did not crumble. Instead, something shifted in her expression, something that Gareth, watching closely, would later describe as a kind of terrible calm, the stillness of a person who knows something the room does not, who is not afraid because fear requires uncertainty, and she had none. My mother told me a great many things before I lost her, Elena said, her voice quiet but carrying with a strange new weight. She told me to keep my head low in rooms that were not ready for the truth. She told me patience was a kind of armor. And she told me, more than once, that there would come a day when someone with power and no wisdom would say something cruel to me in a room full of strangers, believing themselves safe because I had no one to answer for me. Damien's smile faltered, just slightly, though he tried to cover it with a scoff. And what did she tell you to do when that day came? Elena held his gaze without blinking. She told me that if that day ever came, I should simply wait, she said, because I would not be alone for long. For a moment, nothing happened. The hall remained a study in stillness, courtiers exchanging uncertain glances, unsure whether to laugh at the strange defiance of a doomed girl, or to feel, for reasons they could not quite name, a small and unfamiliar prickle of unease. Damien opened his mouth to respond, to dismiss her words as the empty bravado of someone with nothing left to lose, when a sound rolled through the hall that stopped every heart in the room at once. It was not loud, it was not violent. It was simply the sound of the massive front doors, doors that took 4 guards to open on ceremonial occasions, doors that had been shut and barred the moment Elena entered, beginning to move. A low groan of ancient hinges, a slow, deliberate creak, and then, with no visible hand touching them, the great doors of the hall began to swing open. Every guard in the room reached instinctively for a weapon. Every noble drew back. Damien himself turned sharply toward the sound, his authority momentarily forgotten in the face of something his court had no explanation for. Elena did not turn. She did not need to. She simply closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though steadying herself, and when she opened them again, there was something new in her expression. Not fear, not relief exactly. Something closer to quiet inevitability, the calm of a person who has been waiting a very long time for a promise to finally be kept. I did try to warn you, she said softly, almost to herself, as the cold air from the open doorway swept into the hall, and every torch along the walls flickered, as though bowing to whatever now stood at the threshold. Behind her, a shadow began to move. The shadow in the doorway did not rush forward. It simply stepped, once, into the light of the hall, and the courtiers nearest the entrance scrambled backward, as though the temperature itself had dropped. A woman stood there, tall, straight-backed, with silver hair pulled away from a face that seemed both ancient and untouched by time in the same breath. She wore no crown, no jewels, no obvious mark of station, and yet the moment she crossed the threshold, every wolf in that hall felt something ancient stir in their blood, some instinct older than memory that told them to bow before they even understood why. Colin, the captain of the guard, found himself lowering his spear without meaning to. He glanced at his men and saw the same confusion on their faces, the same reflexive deference to a stranger none of them recognized. Damien straightened, forcing his composure back into place, though his voice, when he spoke, carried the faintest crack of uncertainty. "Who dares enter my hall unannounced?" The woman did not answer him immediately. Instead, her eyes moved past him entirely, finding Elena standing alone in the center of the room, and something in her expression softened, just for a moment, into something achingly tender. "You held your ground," the woman said, her voice carrying easily despite its quiet tone, "just as I taught you." Elena's composure finally wavered, not from fear, but from something closer to relief, so deep it nearly buckled her knees. "Grandmother," she whispered. The word landed in the silent hall like a thunderclap. Damien's head turned sharply toward Elena, disbelief flickering across his face. "Grandmother," he repeated, as though testing whether the word made any sense at all. "You claim to have no family. No pack." "I claimed nothing," Elena said, finding her voice again, steadier now with her grandmother's presence beside her. "You assumed, you decided, in front of your entire court, that silence meant absence, and you built your insult on that assumption." The woman who called herself Elena's grandmother walked forward now, unhurried, her steps somehow silencing every whisper in the room, simply by the way they fell against the stone floor. Nobles who moments ago had laughed at Elena's expense now stood frozen, watching, some instinctively lowering their eyes as she passed. "Alpha Damien," she said, stopping a measured distance from the throne, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to make it obvious she had not come to kneel. "I have heard much about you, some of it fair, most of it, apparently, generous." A muscle in Damien's jaw tightened. "You have not answered my question. Who are you, to enter my hall as though you own it?" "My name is Eleanor," the woman said simply, "and I did not come to answer to you, young Alpha. I came because my granddaughter has been gone from my sight for 3 days, and when I finally traced her path, I found guards dragging her toward your court like a common criminal, for the crime of gathering herbs to save a dying child." Whispers erupted through the hall despite the tension, courtiers turning to one another in confusion and disbelief. Gareth, standing near the throne, had gone very still, his eyes narrowing as he studied the newcomer with the particular intensity of a man trying to place a face from a story he had heard only once, long ago, and half dismissed as legend. "Eleanor," he murmured, almost to himself, before his eyes widened slightly. He stepped closer to Damien, lowering his voice, though not quite low enough to escape those nearest the throne. "Alpha, a moment, if I may." Damien barely glanced at him, still focused on the woman before him. "Speak, Gareth." "There is a name from the old records," Gareth said carefully, choosing his words as though each one might detonate if handled wrong. "A bloodline thought, lost nearly a century ago. The first Omegas. Before the packs as we know them, before the Alpha courts, there were bloodlines said to stand as equals to the founding kings, not beneath them. It was said the line ended in fire and betrayal generations ago. If this woman is who I believe her to be." "Say it plainly," Damien snapped, though something in his voice had already begun to shift, some instinct warning him that whatever Gareth was about to say would change everything. Gareth swallowed. "If this is Eleanor of the first line, Alpha, then the girl you just called Motherless in front of your entire court is not merely someone's daughter. She is heir to a bloodline older than your own throne." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the torches along the walls seemed to still their flickering, as though the entire hall was holding its breath. Eleanor allowed the silence to stretch a moment longer before speaking again, her gaze never leaving Damien's face. "My daughter hid Elena from the world the moment she was born," she said. "Not out of shame, Alpha, but out of fear. Fear of exactly this. Fear that a bloodline once hunted, and nearly erased, would draw the same danger to her daughter that it drew to her own mother, and her mother before that." Elena was raised without a title, without a court, without the weight of a name that has cost our family more than most kingdoms could imagine. She was raised safe, ordinary, free. Then why show yourself now? Damien asked, his voice quieter now, though no less guarded. Because ordinary was no longer enough to protect her, Eleanor said simply. Because I felt her fear, the moment your guard seized her. And blood like ours does not ignore a call like that. I came because a king who prides himself on strength decided it was acceptable to humiliate a girl he assumed had no one to answer for her. I came to correct that assumption. Damien's eyes moved from Eleanor to Elena and back again, something calculating now replacing the earlier scorn, the particular recalculation of a man realizing he had gambled carelessly with stakes he never understood. Around him, courtiers who had laughed loudest at Elena's expense now stood pale and silent, some already retreating quietly toward the walls, as though putting distance between themselves and their earlier mockery might somehow erase it from memory. The old laws, Gareth said quietly, still at Damien's side, are specific about insults leveled against the first line. It has been so long since anyone believed the bloodline still existed, that most in this hall likely forgot the law exists at all. But it does, Alpha, and it is not gentle. Damien's hands curled slightly at his sides, the first true crack in his composure showing through. He had built his entire performance in this hall on the assumption that Elena was powerless, that mocking her cost him nothing, because no one of consequence stood behind her. Now an ancient bloodline, thought extinct, stood in his hall, watching him with patient, unreadable eyes, and every noble present had witnessed his cruelty firsthand. I did not know, he said finally, the words clipped, reluctant, unused to being spoken by a man rarely required to explain himself. No, Eleanor agreed. You did not, and that, Alpha Damien, is precisely the problem. You did not know, and so you assumed it was safe to be cruel. That is a dangerous habit for anyone to carry, let alone a king. Elena, watching the exchange, felt something complicated settle in her chest. Vindication, yes, and something like relief that the truth had finally surfaced. But also a strange discomfort at the way the entire hall's perception of her had flipped so completely, so instantly, the moment her bloodline was revealed. An hour ago she had been nothing to these people. Now she watched several nobles straighten in her presence, adjusting their posture, as though preparing to be noticed favorably. It was, she thought, a very small kind of proof for a very large lesson her mother had tried to teach her long ago. People rarely valued a person for who they were. They valued the story attached to a name, and stories could change everything in the space of a single sentence. Damien seemed to sense the same shift moving through his court, and something in his expression hardened again, not with cruelty this time, but with the careful calculation of a ruler, suddenly aware that the ground beneath him had changed shape without warning. What is it you want? He asked slowly, looking directly at Eleanor now, in exchange for peace between us. Eleanor's gaze did not soften, but something in her posture eased, just slightly, as though she had been waiting for precisely this question. That depends entirely, she said, on what you are willing to admit, in front of the same court that watched you humiliate her. The hall waited, breathless, for Damien's answer. Damien did not answer immediately. He was a king who had spent his entire life being obeyed, and the unfamiliar sensation of being questioned in his own hall, in front of his own people, sat poorly with him. Yet even he understood the danger of hesitation now. Every second of silence only deepened the impression that he did not know how to respond to power greater than his own. I spoke without knowing her history, he said finally, choosing his words with visible effort. That was a failure of judgment on my part. A failure of judgment, Eleanor repeated softly, as though tasting the phrase and finding it wanting. You called her motherless in front of 200 witnesses, Alpha. You suggested she was worthless because no one stood behind her. I would ask you to consider how that sentence might have landed on any other Omega in this hall who genuinely has no family left to answer for them. Was your cruelty acceptable then, simply because no ancient bloodline arrived to correct you? The question hit harder than perhaps even Eleanor intended, and Damien's jaw tightened as the weight of it settled over him. Around the hall, several courtiers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how many times they too had mocked someone weaker, assuming the absence of visible power meant the absence of consequence. Priscilla, the noblewoman who had hidden her smile behind a silk-gloved hand earlier, now stood pale near the front of the crowd, her earlier amusement replaced by something closer to dread. She had laughed loudest when Damien mocked Elena. She had, in fact, added her own quiet remark moments before the doors opened, a comment about Omegas who wandered where they did not belong. She prayed now that no one remembered it, though she suspected Eleanor's sharp eyes had already marked her. Damien drew a slow breath, visibly working to steady himself before he spoke again. "You are right," he said, and though the words clearly cost him something, he said them clearly enough for the entire hall to hear. Cruelty should not require a bloodline to make it wrong. I spoke carelessly, and I judged a person's worth by assumptions I had no right to make. That was beneath the standard I claimed to hold as alpha. It was, Elena thought, watching him closely, the first honest thing he had said since she entered the hall. Eleanor studied him a moment longer, as though weighing the sincerity behind his words. "That is a start," she said, "but an apology given only because the balance of power shifted beneath your feet is a cheap kind of honesty, Alpha. I would rather know whether you believe it, or whether you are simply calculating the cost of continued defiance." Damien's eyes flicked briefly to Elena, and for the first time since she had entered the hall, something in his expression shifted into genuine consideration rather than performance. He seemed to actually look at her, perhaps for the first time, rather than at the story attached to her. "I do not know her," he admitted. "I know only that she stood in this hall, alone, facing accusations and mockery from every direction, and she did not break. Whatever her bloodline, that alone tells me I misjudged her character as thoroughly as her lineage." A murmur moved through the court, softer now, less mocking and more contemplative. Gareth, standing near the throne, allowed himself the smallest exhale of relief. He had served under kings who doubled down on cruelty rather than admit fault, and he recognized how rare it was for a young alpha to bend without breaking entirely. Eleanor turned her attention to the wider hall now, addressing the courtiers directly for the first time. "Many of you laughed today," she said, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. "I do not ask that you remember every laugh, every whispered comment, every smile hidden behind a hand. Memory is not always kind enough to hold every small cruelty we commit. But I would ask you to remember how quickly you decided a person's worth, based on nothing more than the absence of a title beside her name." No one spoke. No one dared. "There will always be someone in a room who appears to have no one behind them," Eleanor continued. "No family, no pack, no power. It is easy, in such moments, to believe that person can be treated however you wish, because you assume there will be no consequence. I would ask each of you to consider, from this day forward, whether your kindness depends entirely on the presence of consequence, or whether it exists because it is simply the right way to treat another living creature." The words settled over the hall like a weight, and Elena, standing quietly beside her grandmother, felt something unexpected stir in her chest. Not triumph exactly, though there was some of that. Something closer to hope, the fragile, unfamiliar hope that perhaps this humiliation, this frightening morning, might actually change something beyond her own circumstances. Damien descended the last step from his throne fully now, closing the distance between himself and Elena until only a few feet separated them. Up close, without the theater of his throne behind him, he seemed younger somehow, less certain, the crown on his head suddenly looking heavier than it had moments before. "I owe you a proper apology," he said quietly, meant for her alone, though the hushed hall could still hear every word. "Not the kind given because your grandmother stood behind you, but the kind that should have been given the moment I decided your worth without knowing your story." Elena studied him for a long moment. She thought of her mother's voice, patient and warm, telling her that mercy given freely mattered more than mercy demanded by fear. She thought of the sick child in her village, still waiting for the herbs she had risked so much to gather, herbs that remained forgotten in a basket somewhere near the border of these lands. "I accept your apology," she said finally, "not because you fear what my grandmother might do if you refused, but because I believe, for this moment at least, that you meant it." Something flickered across Damien's face, an expression Elena could not quite name, something between relief and a kind of quiet astonishment that she would extend grace so easily after being humiliated so publicly. "There is still the matter of the old law," Gareth said carefully, breaking the moment. "An apology addresses the insult, Alpha. But the law regarding the first line carries formal weight. It will need to be acknowledged properly, before witnesses, in the record of this court. Eleanor nodded slowly. He is right. Words spoken in a heated moment are one thing. What happens next, in the record that outlives us all, is another. Damien straightened, drawing himself back into something resembling the authority he had entered the hall with, though it now carried a different quality, chastened rather than arrogant. Then let it be recorded properly, he said. Elena of the first line was wronged in this hall today, by my own words and my own failure of judgment. That wrong will be corrected, formally, before this same court. A quiet ripple of surprise moved through the nobles, some exchanging glances that suggested they had never seen their king concede ground so completely, so publicly. Priscilla, still pale near the front of the crowd, felt her stomach twist, with the growing certainty that her own quiet remark might yet be remembered after all. Elena glanced at her grandmother, unspoken questions passing between them, in the way only family who has weathered storms together can communicate without words. Eleanor gave the faintest nod, a silent confirmation that this, for now, was enough. But even as the tension in the hall began to ease, even as courtiers straightened and exhaled, and began the slow work of pretending this morning had not shaken them as deeply as it had, Elena felt a small, persistent unease settle beneath her ribs. Something about the way Gareth had spoken of the old law, the way his careful phrasing suggested there was more to this story than a simple apology could resolve, told her that the true reckoning had not yet arrived. It was only beginning. Later that day, once the court had been dismissed, and the hall emptied of its whispering crowd, Elena sat with her grandmother, in a smaller chamber near the eastern wing, a room with a single window, overlooking the training yards below. A servant had brought tea, though neither of them had touched it, and for a long while, neither spoke. It was Elena who finally broke the silence. "You never told me any of this," she said quietly. "The first line, the old law. I grew up thinking we were simply careful people, private people. I never imagined there was a reason so large behind it." Eleanor set down the cup she had been turning absently between her fingers. "Your mother made a choice when you were born," she said. "A choice I did not entirely agree with at the time, though I understood it, and in the years since, I have come to believe she was wiser than I gave her credit for." "Tell me," Elena said. "All of it. I am tired of learning my own history from other people's assumptions." Eleanor studied her for a long moment, as though weighing how much truth a person could carry at once, before finally nodding. "The first line is older than any pack currently ruling these lands," she began. "Before Alpha Kings claimed territory and built courts and thrones, there were bloodlines who stood beside them, not beneath them. Bloodlines whose omegas were not simply mates or subjects, but leaders in their own right. My grandmother's grandmother helped negotiate the very borders many of these packs still honor today, though most have long forgotten who drew those first lines and why." "Then why does no one remember?" Elena asked. "Why does a name like the first line sound like a forgotten legend instead of living history?" "Because power fears anything it cannot fully control," Eleanor said, her voice growing quieter, heavier with old grief. "There came a generation, nearly a century ago, when certain Alpha Kings decided the first line's influence had grown too large, too independent, too capable of challenging decisions they wished to make unilaterally. What followed was not a war exactly, not one that history books would ever record honestly. It was a quiet erasure. Members of our bloodline were discredited, isolated, in some cases simply disappeared from records entirely, their names removed from lineage, as though they had never existed at all." Elena felt a chill move through her, imagining generations of women, who had once stood as equals to kings, slowly erased from memory by those threatened by their existence. "And you survived that," she said softly. "You and my mother." "Barely," Eleanor admitted. "I was young when the worst of it happened, young enough that I remember mostly fragments, fear, running, the particular quiet of hiding in places no one thought to search. By the time your mother was born, I had learned that survival sometimes meant becoming invisible, rather than fighting to be seen. I taught her to keep our history quiet, to blend into ordinary life, to avoid any court, any pack, any situation that might draw attention to a bloodline others had worked so hard to erase. But she still told me to expect a day like today," Elena said, She still prepared me for exactly this moment, even while hiding the truth behind it. Eleanor's expression softened with something like pride, though sorrow lingered beneath it. Your mother believed, as I do, that erasure only works if the people being erased forget who they were. She could not tell you everything, not while you were young enough that the knowledge might have endangered you before you were ready to carry it, but she made certain you understood your own worth, regardless of whether the world recognized it. She made certain that if a day came when someone tried to diminish you, you would have the strength to stand your ground until help arrived. Elena thought of her mother's voice again, the countless small lessons woven into ordinary moments throughout her childhood, lessons she had never fully understood until this very day. Keep your head low in rooms not ready for the truth. Patience is a kind of armor. You will not be alone for long. Each one had seemed, at the time, like ordinary motherly wisdom. Now she understood they had been preparation all along. A quiet inheritance passed down not through titles or crowns, but through careful words meant to protect her long after her mother could no longer stand beside her. "Where is she now?" Elena asked, the question she had been afraid to voice all day finally surfacing. "My mother. Is she safe? Is she hiding somewhere, watching, the way you were before you walked through those doors?" Eleanor's expression grew heavier, and for a long moment she did not answer, her eyes drifting toward the window, as though searching the training yards below for words that did not come easily. "Your mother is not hiding, Elena," she said finally, gently. "She has been gone for many years now. She made certain you were safe, made certain you were placed with a family who would raise you with love and no knowledge of the danger surrounding your birth, and then she disappeared from the records entirely, the same way our bloodline disappeared a generation before her. I do not know, even now, whether she chose that path or whether it was chosen for her." The words landed softly but struck deeply, and Elena felt something long buried shift inside her chest, an old grief she had never fully understood the shape of until this moment. She had grown up with a family who loved her, who had never explained where she came from, beyond gentle reassurances that she was wanted, chosen, cherished. She had assumed, in the vague way children often assume things they are not given full explanations for, that her birth mother had simply been unable to care for her. She had never imagined a story this large, this dangerous, waiting quietly behind the ordinary shape of her life. "I am sorry," Eleanor said softly, reaching across the small table to take Elena's hand. "I know this is a great deal to carry all at once. Today alone would have been enough, standing before that court, facing a king's cruelty in front of strangers. And now I have added the weight of an entire hidden history on top of it." Elena was quiet for a long moment, turning the truth over carefully, examining it from every angle, the way she might examine an unfamiliar herb, before deciding whether it was safe to use. "I am not upset that you told me," she said finally. "I am grateful. I would rather carry the full weight of the truth than continue living inside a story built on careful omissions. I have spent my whole life sensing there was something unspoken beneath the surface of things. It is strange, but almost a relief, to finally understand what it was." Eleanor squeezed her hand gently, something like pride glowing quietly in her tired eyes. "Your mother would be proud of the way you carried yourself today," she said. "Not simply because you stood your ground before an alpha king, though that alone would have made her proud, but because even in the face of cruelty, even believing yourself utterly alone in that hall, you did not abandon the values she raised you with. You did not lash out. You did not beg. You simply told the truth and waited for it to be recognized." A comfortable silence settled between them then, the first true quiet either of them had experienced since the guards had dragged Elena from the forest path that morning. Outside the window, the training yards below had grown busy again, young wolves sparring under the watchful eyes of instructors, ordinary life continuing, despite the extraordinary morning that had unfolded above them. But even in that quiet moment, Elena's mind kept returning to Gareth's careful words about the old law, the formal weight it carried, the sense that whatever came next would not simply end with an apology and a shared cup of tea between grandmother and granddaughter. Somewhere beyond this small chamber, a court was already recalculating what her presence meant, what obligations it created, what dangers it might invite from corners neither she nor Eleanor could yet see clearly. She was still turning these thoughts over, when a soft knock sounded at the chamber door, and a familiar voice, calm but urgent, spoke from the other side. "Forgive the interruption," Gareth said, stepping into the room the moment Eleanor granted him entry. "But there is something you both need to hear, before this matter goes any further. Word of what happened in the hall today has already begun to spread beyond these walls, and not everyone who has heard it intends to receive it kindly." Eleanor rose from her seat immediately, her earlier warmth replaced by the sharp, alert focus of someone who had spent decades learning to read danger before it fully arrived. "Speak plainly, Gareth. What has happened?" Gareth closed the door behind him and lowered his voice, though the small chamber offered little risk of eavesdroppers. "News of the First Line's return does not stay contained within one hall for long, especially not when 200 witnesses saw it with their own eyes. Messengers left this palace within the hour, some carrying gossip, others carrying something closer to alarm. There are alphas in neighboring territories who benefited greatly from the belief that your bloodline had been erased entirely, Eleanor. Some of them built their current standing on land and influence taken directly from families like yours during the years of erasure." Eleanor's expression darkened, though she did not seem surprised. "And now those same alphas will hear that the First Line still walks among the living," she said. "They will not celebrate the news." "No," Gareth agreed grimly. "Some will see it as a threat to holdings they have grown comfortable claiming as their own. Others may see it as an opportunity, a chance to align themselves with a bloodline that once held real influence, hoping to benefit from association rather than opposition. Either way, the quiet you and your granddaughter enjoyed for so many years has likely ended the moment those doors opened in the hall today." Elena felt her earlier relief curdle into something closer to dread. She had barely begun to absorb the truth of her own history, and already the consequences of that truth were rippling outward into dangers she could not yet fully understand. "What does this mean for us?" she asked. "For my village? For the people I left behind this morning, the ones who have no idea any of this happened?" Gareth's expression softened slightly at the genuine worry in her voice. "Your village is likely safe for now," he said. "Word will take time to travel that far, and there is little reason for anyone to target ordinary villagers over a matter concerning bloodlines and old laws. My greater concern is closer to home. Alpha Damien's apology today, however sincere, has already reached ears beyond this palace. There will be those among his own allies who see his willingness to bend as weakness, an invitation to test him, to test the strength of a throne they may have assumed was more rigid than it apparently is." Damien himself appeared in the doorway then, having clearly heard enough of the conversation from the hallway to understand its weight. He entered without waiting for permission, his earlier composure now edged with something more focused, more alert. "You believe my apology has weakened my standing," he said, addressing Gareth directly, though his eyes moved briefly to Elena and Eleanor as he spoke. "I believe," Gareth said carefully, "that any perceived weakness, whether real or imagined, invites challenge from those already looking for an excuse. There are alphas who have quietly resented your rule since you took the throne young, Damien. They will not see today's apology as growth or honesty. They will see it as an opening." Damien absorbed this in silence for a moment, his jaw tightening as he weighed the political weight of a decision he had made, in the end, simply because it was right. "Then let them come," he said finally, though there was less bravado in the words than there might have been that morning, more the tired resolve of someone accepting a burden rather than performing strength for an audience. "I will not undo an apology that was owed, simply because cowards might use my honesty against me." Eleanor studied him with an unreadable expression, something between cautious respect and lingering wariness. "Brave words," she said, "but bravery alone did not save my bloodline the first time it was hunted, Alpha. It will take more than good intentions to protect Elena now that her existence is no longer a secret." "Then tell me what will," Damien said, and for the first time, there was no trace of arrogance in the request, only genuine urgency. "You have survived erasure once already. You understand threats I have not yet had to face. If there is a path forward that protects her, I want to hear it." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying him carefully, as though testing the sincerity behind his words, the way one might test the weight of a blade before trusting it. Finally she spoke. "The old law that Gareth mentioned earlier carries more than the weight of a formal apology," she said. "It carries the possibility of formal recognition, a binding acknowledgement before witnesses and record keepers that the First Line standing within this territory is legitimate, protected, and equal in weight to your own throne's authority on matters concerning our bloodline. Such recognition would not simply address today's insult. It would place Elena, and by extension myself, under a protection that even ambitious neighboring alphas would think twice before challenging. And if I offer that recognition, Damien said slowly, what would it cost me? Politically, I mean. I understand there is always a cost. It would cost you the illusion of absolute authority, Eleanor said plainly. It would mean acknowledging, formally and permanently, that there exists a bloodline within your territory, whose standing you cannot simply overrule on a whim, the way you attempted to overrule Elena's dignity this morning before you understood who she was. Some of your allies may see that as a loss of power. Others, wiser ones, may see it as evidence of a king secure enough in his own authority that he does not fear sharing space with another form of legitimate power. Damien was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing the political calculus of a decision that would ripple far beyond this single afternoon. Elena watched him closely, curious despite herself about which version of him would ultimately answer, the performative king who had mocked her hours earlier, or the quieter, more thoughtful man who had emerged in the aftermath of his own mistake. Elena, he said finally, turning to address her directly, rather than continuing to negotiate solely with her grandmother. This decision concerns you more than anyone else in this room. What do you want? Not what your grandmother believes is safest. Not what I believe protects my own throne most effectively. What do you actually want, now that you know the full weight of what stands behind your name? The question caught her off guard, and for a moment she simply looked at him, surprised that he had thought to ask at all, given how thoroughly the morning had begun, with him deciding her worth, without ever once considering her own voice in the matter. I want to go home, she said finally, honestly. I want to check on the child I was gathering herbs for this morning, and make certain the fever has broken. I want to return to a life where I am not defined entirely by a bloodline I only just learned the true weight of, but I understand now that such a simple life may no longer be fully possible, not with the truth already spreading beyond these walls. So if formal recognition offers real protection, not just to me, but to anyone who might be endangered simply by association with my name, then I would rather face that truth directly than hide from it the way my mother and grandmother were forced to for so many years. Eleanor's eyes glistened faintly with something like pride as she listened, though she said nothing, allowing Elena's own voice to carry the weight of the decision. Damien studied Elena for a long moment, something in his expression settling into quiet resolve. Then let it be done properly, he said. Formal recognition, before the full court, with the old law, observed exactly as it demands. Whatever cost it brings to my standing among neighboring alphas, I would rather face that challenge honestly than allow the same kind of quiet erasure that nearly destroyed your family once before to happen again under my watch. Gareth exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly at the king's decisive answer, though his expression remained cautious. Then we should move quickly, he said, before rumor outpaces the truth, and before anyone beyond this palace decides to test the strength of a recognition that has not yet been formally made. As the four of them began discussing the details of what such a ceremony would require, Elena found her mind drifting briefly to the sick child waiting in her village, to the ordinary life she had lived just that morning, before everything shifted so completely beneath her feet. She wondered, with a strange mixture of grief and hope, whether she would ever fully return to that simplicity again, or whether the truth revealed today had permanently redrawn the shape of the life ahead of her. Either way, she realized, there was no path back to not knowing. There was only the path forward, and for the first time in her life, she would not be walking it alone. 3 days later, the great hall filled once again, this time with far more ceremony than the hurried, chaotic gathering that had first brought Elena before the court. Word had indeed spread, just as Gareth predicted, and among the assembled crowd stood not only Damien's usual court, but representatives sent quietly from several neighboring territories, drawn by curiosity, concern, or calculation, each watching to see how this unprecedented recognition would unfold. Elena stood near the base of the throne, dressed simply but neatly, in clothing her grandmother had insisted upon, nothing ostentatious, nothing that pretended she was something she was not. She had refused the elaborate robes Gareth's staff had initially offered, insisting instead on something closer to what she might have worn in her own village, a quiet reminder to herself, if no one else, of exactly where she had come from, and who she still intended to remain. Beside her, Eleanor stood with the calm bearing of someone who had waited decades for a moment like this, though her expression carried more solemnity than triumph. She understood, better than anyone in the hall, how fragile such recognitions could prove, if not handled with care, and how quickly old resentments could resurface, even after formal acknowledgement. Damien addressed the court first, his voice carrying the same commanding authority it always had, though something in his bearing had shifted subtly since the morning of Elena's humiliation. There was less performance in it now, less need to prove dominance through volume or spectacle, and more of the steady weight of a leader, genuinely reckoning with a mistake, rather than simply managing its fallout. 3 days ago, he began, I stood in this very hall and spoke words I deeply regret. I called a woman motherless, without pack, without worth, based on nothing more than my own careless assumptions. I was wrong, not simply because that woman turned out to carry a bloodline older than my own throne, but because cruelty toward anyone, believed to be powerless, is a failure of character, regardless of whether power eventually proves otherwise. A hush had fallen over the assembled crowd, courtiers and visiting representatives alike listening closely, some clearly surprised by the directness of his admission. Today, Damien continued, I formally recognize Elena of the first line, and her grandmother Eleanor, as holding legitimate standing within this territory, protected under the old law, equal in weight to any claim my own throne might make, regarding matters that concern their bloodline. This is not a gift I offer out of fear of what might happen should I refuse it, though I will not pretend such consequences played no role in my consideration. It is, more importantly, a correction of an injustice that should never have required a bloodline's ancient authority to be taken seriously in the first place. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some approving, some clearly uneasy at the precedent being set. Priscilla, still visibly nervous, days after her own quiet mockery in the earlier gathering, watched with an expression caught somewhere between relief that the focus had shifted away from individual courtiers and lingering fear that it might yet return. Gareth stepped forward then, carrying the formal scroll that would record the recognition officially, reading the old law's precise language aloud, for the benefit of those unfamiliar with its ancient wording. The language was old, formal, deliberately weighty, designed centuries ago to ensure that recognitions of this kind could not be easily undone or reinterpreted by future rulers seeking to reclaim ground they had once ceded. As the ceremony continued, Elena found her attention drawn briefly to a cluster of visiting representatives near the back of the hall, their expressions harder to read than those of Damien's familiar court. One in particular, an older alpha wearing the deep blue colors of a distant northern territory, watched the proceedings with an intensity that made Elena's instincts prickle uncomfortably, though she could not have said exactly why. When the formal reading concluded, Damien turned to Elena directly, extending a hand not in the manner of a king granting favor, but in the simpler gesture of one person acknowledging another as an equal. Is there anything further you wish to say to this court? He asked, now that the record has been properly set. Elena considered the question carefully before stepping forward to address the hall herself, her voice steady, despite the weight of so many eyes upon her once again. 3 days ago, she said, I stood in this hall and was told I was nothing, simply because no one visible stood behind me. I want to say, clearly, that the lesson I hope this moment leaves behind is not that bloodline alone determines worth. My grandmother's presence changed how quickly I was believed and protected, yes, but it should not have taken an ancient bloodline to make cruelty toward me unacceptable in the first place. She paused, glancing briefly at Damien before continuing. There are people in every village, every territory, every court, who have no bloodline behind them at all. No ancient law to invoke should someone in power decide to humiliate them. I would ask this hall, and any who carry word of today's ceremony beyond these walls, to remember that the standard for basic decency should never depend on whether the person in front of you turns out to be powerful. It should simply exist, freely given, regardless of what stands behind someone's name. The hall remained quiet for a long moment after she finished, the weight of her words settling differently than the earlier formal proceedings had. Even Damien, standing beside her, seemed to absorb the point fully, something like genuine humility crossing his features, rather than the practiced diplomacy he had shown throughout most of the ceremony. She is right, he said finally, addressing the court once more. Let today's recognition stand not only as acknowledgement of a bloodline's return, but as a reminder that this court's standards of respect should never have required such a return to enforce them in the first place. From this day forward, I intend for that standard to apply regardless of lineage, regardless of visible power, regardless of whether anyone stands ready to correct my mistakes should I make them again. As the ceremony drew to its formal close, and the assembled crowd began the slow process of dispersing, Elena felt Eleanor's hand rest gently on her shoulder, a quiet, wordless acknowledgement of pride that needed no elaborate speech to convey its weight. But even amid the relief of the moment, Elena's eyes drifted once more toward the northern representative near the back of the hall, who had not joined the murmured approval of those around him. Instead, he watched Elena with a calculating stillness that lingered in her mind long after the ceremony ended, a quiet reminder that formal recognition, however hard won, did not erase every danger that had begun stirring the moment her bloodline's return became known beyond these walls. Some battles, she understood now, were won in a single afternoon. Others were only just beginning. The following weeks brought a strange new rhythm to Elena's life, one that balanced uneasily between the quiet world she had known before and the far larger one now unfolding around her. She returned to her village within days of the ceremony, relieved beyond words to find the sick child, a boy named Toby, already recovering, his fever finally broken by the very herbs she had risked so much to gather that fateful morning. His mother wept with gratitude when Elena arrived, unaware of everything that had happened in her absence, and for a brief, precious afternoon, Elena allowed herself to simply exist as the herbalist her village had always known, rather than the heir to a bloodline half the region now whispered about. But the world she had stepped into could not be so easily set aside, and within a fortnight, Gareth arrived at her village personally, carrying word that the Northern Alpha who had watched the ceremony with such unsettling focus had begun making quiet inquiries about the first line's exact standing, testing whether Damien's formal recognition might contain loopholes worth exploiting. It was not yet a direct threat, Gareth assured her, but it was the kind of careful probing that often preceded one. Elena found, to her own surprise, that she did not retreat from this news the way she might have imagined herself doing only weeks earlier. Instead, something steady and resolved had settled into her since the day she stood in that hall and refused to break beneath Damien's cruelty. She agreed to divide her time between her village and the palace, learning from Eleanor the histories and responsibilities that came with her bloodline, while still returning regularly to tend the herb gardens and treat the illnesses of people who had known her long before any of this began. Damien, for his part, proved true to the promise he had made in that final ceremony. He established new protections within his court, formal standards of conduct that applied regardless of a person's visible standing or lineage, and though not everyone in his court embraced the change gracefully, the shift was undeniable. Priscilla, still shaken by how close her own careless mockery had come to public consequence, became, somewhat to Elena's amusement, one of the more vocal supporters of the new standards, eager to distance herself from any association with the cruelty of that first gathering. Between Elena and Damien, something quieter and more complicated had begun to grow in the weeks following the ceremony, something neither of them rushed to name. He sought her counsel more often than court formality required, and she found herself, despite her initial wariness, drawn to the version of him that had emerged in the aftermath of his mistake, a man willing to be corrected, willing to grow, rather than simply defend the comfort of his own authority. It was not romance exactly, not yet, but it was the slow, careful building of respect between two people who had begun their acquaintance in the worst possible way, and chosen, deliberately, to build something better from those ashes. Eleanor watched this development with the quiet, knowing patience of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the shape of something meaningful before it had fully bloomed. She did not push Elena toward it, nor did she caution against it, understanding that her granddaughter had earned the right to choose her own path forward, free from the same fear and hiding that had shaped so much of Eleanor's own life. Months later, when the Northern Alpha's quiet probing finally escalated into a formal challenge, questioning the legitimacy of the first line's renewed standing, before a gathering of regional leaders, Elena stood once more before a room full of skeptical eyes, though this time she was not alone, not merely in the sense of having her grandmother beside her, but in the deeper sense of having built, in those intervening months, genuine standing of her own. She spoke not as a girl once called Motherless, but as someone who had earned the respect of the very court that had once mocked her, someone whose worth no longer depended solely on the bloodline behind her name, but on the character she had demonstrated in every difficult moment since. The challenge, in the end, dissolved beneath the weight of her composure, and the formal protection Damien had ensured could not be easily unwound. The Northern Alpha withdrew his inquiries, recognizing, perhaps, that the girl he had hoped to find vulnerable had instead grown into someone far harder to diminish than he had anticipated. Elena often thought back, in quiet moments, to that first terrible morning, to the sound of the great doors slamming shut behind her, to Damien's cruel words echoing across the silent hall. She did not forget the sting of that humiliation, nor did she pretend it had not shaped her deeply. But she came to understand, over the months that followed, that the true turning point of her story had never really been the moment her grandmother walked through those doors, dramatic and vindicating as that moment had been. The true turning point had been earlier, quieter, easier to miss. It had been the moment she chose not to break beneath cruelty she believed. In that instant, she would have to face entirely alone. It was in that choice, made before any help arrived, before any bloodline was revealed, before any ancient law offered its protection, that the real strength of her story had first taken root. Everything that followed, the recognition, the growing respect, the quiet, patient bond forming between herself and a king who had learned to be better than his first impression of her, all of it had grown from that single, unshakable decision to stand her ground with dignity, even when she believed no one was coming to stand beside her. And perhaps, she thought, watching the sun set gently over the palace grounds one quiet evening many months later, that was the truest lesson her mother had ever tried to teach her, long before any of this began. Not that help would always arrive in time, not that ancient bloodlines or old laws could always be relied upon to right every wrong, but that the strength to stand tall in the face of cruelty had to exist inside a person first, independent of whoever might or might not walk through the door behind them. Everything else, she had come to understand, was simply what grew from that unshakable root.